On the international business scene, the dollar hovered near a two-decade high against major peers on Monday, ahead of a week loaded with market holidays and central bank decisions from Washington to London and Tokyo. The dollar index, which measures the currency against six counterparts, was 0.2% stronger than Friday at 109.84, consolidating its dominance after a volatile couple of weeks that took it as high as 110.79 on September the 7th. For the first time since mid-2002. Investors have scrambled to price in higher U.S. interest rates and a stronger dollar as U.S. consumer price rises have proven stubbornly persistent. The risk of a Eurozone recession has reached its highest level since July 2020 as concerns grow that a winter energy squeeze will cause a slump in economic activity. Economists now put the probability of 2 straight quarters of contraction at 80% in the next 12 months, up from 60% in a previous survey. Germany, the bloc's largest economy and among the most exposed to cutbacks in gas supplies, is likely to shrink from as early as this quarter. In Asia, yuan fell, an indication that China's latest attempts to beef up the currency with a record pushback in the reference rates and verbal warnings are barely holding back a selling wave. The People's Bank of China fixed the yuan at 6.94 per dollar, 647 pips stronger than the average estimates in a survey of analysts and traders, the widest difference on record since 2018. The onshore yuan dropped as much as 0.6% on Monday, even as state media cited the regulator as saying that companies should not bet on the direction and extent of currency moves. According to Goldman Sachs, China's twice-a-decade Communist Party Congress may fail to give equity markets a boost this time around as COVID restrictions and a property market slump add to pressures on the economy. Goldman expects China's zero-COVID policy, which has been offsetting the impacts of policy easing measures, to stay until the second quarter of next year. Hedge funds ramped up bearish yen bets to a 3-month high on expectations that Japan would languish in a world where developed market peers are racing to hike interest rates. Data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission shows leveraged funds added 18,836 net short contracts last week, the largest increase since last March. The positions came during a turbulent week for markets, driven in part by hotter than expected U.S. consumer prices that turbocharged expectations of aggressive Federal Reserve rate hikes, while the Bank of Japan is seen standing flat. And finally, a slide in cryptocurrencies on Monday put Bitcoin on the cusp of the lowest level since 2020, ahead of a global wave of monetary tightening that's expected to stretch from Europe to the U.S. this week. The largest digital token sank as much as 6.7% and was trading at $18,500 early this morning in London. Investors are bracing for volatility from the jumbo interest rate hike expected this week from the Federal Reserve to fight price pressures. And a lot of talk there about what the markets are doing and what the markets are saying. But when we come back, the markets seem to be pointing towards a global recession. The big question on our minds is, what would that mean for the African continent? The conversation after this. Just 2 years after the pandemic-induced global recession of 2020, the world economy is again facing difficult challenges. As growth is slowing sharply, fears of another recession are rising. Stagflationary pressures are also mounting as inflation reaches new multi-decade highs in many countries. Geopolitical tensions are casting a long shadow over global growth prospects, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine magnifying pre-existing supply-side challenges and intensifying volatility in commodity markets. Moreover, rising global borrowing costs are heightening the risk of financial stress among the many emerging markets and developing economies that over the past decade have accumulated debts at the fastest pace in more than half a century. I have Gospel Obele, Chief Economist at Streetnomics, to take us through this and look at what this also means for Africa. Gospel, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu. Good morning. Thank you for having me today.
So I think we need to start with even asking if we're fully out of the 2020 COVID-19 induced global recession. So that happened, and while it seems like the world is heading towards another one, others are saying we never fully exited that recession. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Tolu. Personally, I do not think that Nigeria or African economies are really out of the recession from the pandemic, the double blow recession from the pandemic, to say. I think that what we're now seeing is sort of like a roller coaster of events that have worsened the quality of life, and that disposable income, and also worsened mainstream supply chain, which is going to sort of like position the economy, at the brink of another recession.
Okay, so from there, we saw that sub-Saharan Africa entered its first recession in 50 years. This rolled back decades of economic growth as well as progress. So what you're saying now is that even that recession we entered, we're just barely scraping out of it, because there are, of course, the definitions, the business definitions of recessions. It must be this, and this that happens. But when you look at, as you said now, the living standards, the cost of living right now, as it is for many Africans across the continent, those things are still there. So our recovery has not happened, or we're somewhat to a few steps down the line in recovery?
So, I mean, here's how it works. The construct around GDP, which is largely used to measure global growth or national growth, or, as it were, says that recession is when you have at least 2 quarters of negative growth. But GDP only tells you about economic activities, really, in terms of are they picking up or going down. But the narrative for the average Nigerian or the average African hinges more around, they are being threatened around core productivity areas, core standard of living areas, and huge cost dynamics in terms of everyday living and everyday doing business, which also in turn gets to slow down economic activities over a period of time. So it's just a matter of time you begin to see GDP respond, but any intentional investor or analyst or anybody seeking to do very, very intentional things, by watching the movement and the tone of productivity dynamics or productivity enablers, you understand that Nigerians or Africans, or to a fair extent, are already living in a recession. It's just a matter of time for the numbers to catch up. And also the numbers will actually do justice in terms of capturing the reality in terms of context of things. So I do not personally think that Africans or Nigerians in particular have really recovered from a 2020 recession. What I think is that they've evolved into a new cycle of cost crisis, which invariably is a very fancy way of saying that you're very close to another recession.
Wow.
And also to add in 2020 and 2021, for the Streetnomics team, we had on our outlook, we had noted that the country or the continent is largely sitting on the fence, and at the brink of another recession. Because, now we're looking at global dynamics around geopolitics, broken down supply chain, impacting on core cost drivers and commodity prices. There needs to be economic variables only. But now we've seen global health in 2020, and in 2022 we are seeing geopolitics. So the dynamics of elements, of variables, of characteristics that are informing cost pressure or possible global recessions are no longer just economic variables. They are now shifting from economic variables to a cluster of other multidisciplinary variables that hold the power to shape consumer spending. And when it begins to happen in that order, then recession is not far-fetched in the context of things.
So what I hear from you is, at the end of the day, it's the numbers that will catch up with where the citizens are already living in their day-to-day lives in a recession. So that means you are not one of those who thinks right now that the World Bank is actually exaggerating. There are a few people who think that the World Bank is unnecessarily sounding alarm bells and is over-exaggerating the potential for another global recession. Are you one of those?
Of course not. From my responses, you see that I'm not. And that's because from 2020, I've also sounded this warning that not just, the context of this conversation is Africa, right? African economies are much more vulnerable,
yes,
and sitting on the fence, meaning that within the context of things, there's a higher possibility that we'll slide into recession within a shorter period of time. I made those predictions in 2020 as well as 2021, but I didn't know it was going to happen so fast, But that's to tell you what are the downsides, in quotes, of globalization in terms of how elements and variables work together as it were. So I don't think the World Bank is exaggerating. I think that institutional players need to sit back and really begin to rethink how they approach interest rates, how they approach inflation, and other core dynamics that may be shaping, for a faster downturn or a faster trajectory towards a global recession.
So I like the fact that you've talked about these variables, that right now what we're seeing is that the economic variables are even being overtaken by health variables as well as geopolitical variables. So because it takes me to my next questions, in which we're looking at the economic principles that seem to agree: raise interest rates, bring inflation down, cool the markets and cool the system, but it just is not working, or it's not working as much as the economic principles have had the equation work before. Are there no other options? This week, we're expecting a number of interest rate hikes again. The U.S. Federal Reserve has doubled down, and it seems where the U.S. goes, the rest of the world also follows. Are there no other options left for the institutions to do in this situation?
Tolu, it's just like saying that do global GDP or national GDP figures really tell the real story of the average standard of living of people, and that's one reason why people don't really trust GDP figures. And that's why it looks as though the economic variables are not telling the fact or are not reflecting the reality of things. What it simply means is that the world needs to catch up in its framework, in its design, and in its interpretation of events. Since 2000, since the internet boom and all of that, the world changed. Globalization came to the fore. And with globalization came many evolving elements, meaning that the era of trying to use a monetary policy instrument like interest rates to manage inflation has come and gone. Or rather, the era of using a monetary policy instrument only to manage inflation that is not driven by monetary elements, all right, has come and gone. Technically, I understand that the underlying rule here is price stability. But then, what are the forces shaping price stability or threatening against price stability in the times we live in? So, economists, and the use of economic policy has to evolve in its thinking, in its measurement, and in the construct of solutions, to deal with the problems we are facing today. The inflationary elements are more of geopolitical transferring to broken supply chains and all of those things. And that's why you're having inflation. Until we begin to rethink this pathway, just the way we need to rethink how we, sell the GDP narrative. Because like I mentioned when I started speaking on this context, is we're already in a recession technically. The GDP figures will catch up. Will catch up. And they don't really reflect the timely, situation of things because it's based on activity, not productivity. So we need to understand that economic variables need to evolve and how we interpret and use them for solutions. And within that context, I do not think that interest rate as a standalone is enough a tool to solving or to managing the inflationary crisis we face today. I believe that the inflationary crises are more more structurally and geopolitically driven than monetary driven.
All right, so Gospel, I need to let us drill down more a bit now into the African continent particularly. And we see from the reports that rising global borrowing costs will put financial stress on many emerging markets and developing economies. And that talks about the accumulated debt that we've had over the past decade. And part of that has also been the fact that this comprehensive new study coming from the World Bank has shown that the potential for a global recession also puts a string of financial crisis in emerging markets and developing economies, and that it would do them more lasting harm. So what kind of crisis are we looking at? What kind of lasting harm should we be taking cognizance of right now?
Yeah, so the World Bank talked about the borrowing crisis and the challenge around that. Another side to that story as well is that with inflation, the interesting thing, Tolu, is that the inflation crisis permeates, or the pressure from inflation hits heavily on food and basic necessities. Food, basic necessities, and that translates heavily to a cost of living crisis, which automatically means that the consumer spending and consumer disposable income has shrunk significantly over time, especially on a month-on-month. Now, when you look at it within the context of consumers or economic agents being able to pay back loans, there's going to be a very huge challenge there. A lot of banks are going to record high NPLs, non-performing loans. There's going to be a lot of bad debts because, there's also going to be a lot of loan defaults, and banks who are smarter will start looking for creative ways to make provisions for those defaults and all of that. But that's to tell you that the crisis we're in is much more deeper than we think. The long-term solution would be that, number one, we need to start rethinking our approach to policy making and how we even seek to tackle the inflationary crisis. And it has to be comprehensive. But unfortunately, I mean, there's also what we call trade incapacity. You know a thing so well, you know how that thing works so well, but you're not open to newer ways to be thinking how that same thing can work or how those same results can be achieved, if better. So we need to first rethink how economic policy and how economic instruments, in quotes, are used to drive down inflation and until that begins to happen, inflationary numbers won't improve or won't get better, and the cost of, because this is expected to run or happen, to continue all the way down to 2023 in terms of the low cost of living crisis. So the web of effects are really, really severe. And for nations like Africa or Nigeria, it's just a matter of time, if not months.
Wow, a matter of time. So let's talk about that. And let's look at what happened before. So previous recessions have shown that the risk of allowing inflation to stay elevated for long while growth is weak is not a good one. The 1982 recession triggered more than 40 debt crises and ushered in a decade of lost growth in many developing economies. And we can, of course, look at what happened to many countries here on the continent. Gospel, what would another global recession mean for African economies at this time?
I mean, it's the last thing that we want to experience. I mean, the way the mechanisms really work is that inflation frustrates borrowing / it's consumer spending and all of that. And when consumer spending is hijacked, borrowing is hijacked, and the cut and repayment challenges are also in view, you also see a comprehensive slowdown in economic activities, which is the economic activities that GDP actually measures. This is why I say GDP is actually a reactive measure than a proactive measure. But however, this would mean a lot of struggle for many people globally. And do not forget that the word recession comes with its own fears. So we're still using the term cost of living crisis. But by the time that term evolves into a recession, depending, it's going to bring down a lot of fears, and it's going to also affect investor confidence in economies. Economies are much more volatile. Consumers will be it's going to be tougher a lot more for brands, for businesses. The business environment will be a lot more harsher than expected, and the overall fear of uncertainty will hike. And which is why economists and policy stakeholders are careful of using the term recession.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really going to be a good picture. However, there's also light at the end of the tunnel if businesses can rethink engagement differently. It's an era of change leadership, not change management. Change management simply means you're trying to adopt your business model to the times we live in. Mm-hmm. Change leadership will mean that you're trying to see through the times we live in, to be able to evolve and sort of like lead more proactively and stay in business, or improve your financial management as an individual, which is the main thing here going forward.
All right, my final question is this. From that report that the World Bank released, it said that even a moderate hit to the global economy over the next year could tip it into recession. What does that moderate hit look like? What could it be? Is it a continuation of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which has continued with soaring food prices, soaring fuel prices, and even, of course, that cost of living crisis? Is it maybe a reemergence of something like COVID? We've seen China continue with its zero COVID policy, maybe having that, unfortunately, reemerge in larger scale. What could a moderate hit really look like if we're not simply looking at these economic variables alone?
The moderate hit would mean keeping everything constant. So let's say the Russian-Ukraine war continues, commodity prices begin to, increase some more. Commercial banks or global central banks, continue to increase interest rates at a synchronizing level consistently. So it will technically mean that not doing anything really big and not reducing your efforts. You're just really, everything that's happening right now continues at the pace, and maybe some slight worsening of the issues at some critical junctures, so those elements will really, really shape and by global recession, the World Bank simply means if a quarter of negative growth, and another quarter of negative growth. But I am saying that I think recession is already existing as an experience, in form of worsening cost of living crisis, slowdown in economic activities, which we already see by the GDP numbers. It's just a matter of time.
All right, Gospel Obele, thank you so much. Recession is already existing as an experience for many. It's just for the numbers to catch up. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.
All right. And unfortunately, one of the things he said is very true. This cost of living crisis is one that is being experienced across the continent. And maybe it's just when the data and the National Bureaus of Statistics and the central banks come out with the figures that officially we will hear the truth. But what the World Bank has also suggested is that central banks could combat inflation without triggering a global recession by communicating their policy decisions clearly, while policymakers should put in place credible medium-term fiscal plans and also continue to provide targeted relief to vulnerable households. How many countries, how many economies across the continent are doing just that now? That's a question we should look to answer. You're watching Business Edge. That's it for today's show. But before we wrap things up, we have NC4 to watch. A few stories we're keeping our eyes on. And the stories we are tracking right here on News Central starts with, of course, Nigeria and the western part of the continent. The country's midterm expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper has revealed that debt servicing gulped 6.16 trillion naira in 16 months. Last year, the government spent 4.22 trillion on debt servicing and another 1.94 trillion between January and April 2022. A breakdown shows that domestic debt servicing cost 2.05 trillion naira, while foreign debt servicing took 946.29 billion in 2021. Following amendments on the Computer Misuse Act 2011 that were recently passed in Uganda, the government says misuse of the internet will now attract hefty fines of up to 16 million Ugandan shillings, about $4,200, and longer jail terms of up to 10 years. The amendments, now awaiting the president's signature to become law, seek to enhance provisions on unauthorized access to information or data, prohibit the sharing of any information relating to a child without authorization from a parent or guardian, and prohibits the sending or sharing of information that promotes hate speech. In Q2 2022, Kaspersky Solutions detected 40,788 new modifications of miners. According to their data in the Africa region, the number of home users affected by crypto miners in Q2 of 2022 decreased slightly compared to the previous quarter. However, the possibility of a surge in crypto mining attacks persists and could be directly correlated to cryptocurrency exchange rates. And finally, gold prices slipped on Monday as investors braced for aggressive rate hikes by major central banks this week, especially from the U.S. Federal Reserve to tame inflation. Earlier today, spot gold was down 0.3% to $1,669 per ounce. U.S. gold futures fell 0.2% to $1,679. Gold is known as a safe investment amid inflation woes, but high interest rates increase the opportunity cost of holding non-yielding gold. And that's the business we have for you. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can download our mobile app and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep track of the conversations we have right here on News Central. You can watch us on DSTV channel 422, StarTimes channel 274, Avo TV, OHP, and a number of other online platforms. I'll be back 11 a.m. West African time tomorrow for another conversation, or maybe more, that puts African business, the economy, and finance front and center. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Have a fantastic day.